Yeah. Kakiokitātum skātanu. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of meskanâs kâpimâcimohk. I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Ng-A-Fook in Ottawa, and we're just about to go for a walk talk. So I'm going to put this thing on, and while I'm doing that, Nick's going to tell us a little bit about himself.
Did you pause it?
No.
Hey.
So yeah, Nick, introduce the folks to yourself.
Well,
who you are.
My name's Nicholas Ng-A-Fook, and if we think of our names and how important they are, my last name actually is named after my great-grandfather, Ng-A-Fook, and he was Hakka, of Hakka descent, and so they came over from the Guangdong province in the 1870s to South America, to Guyana, when after Britain abolished the economics of slavery, right? And after they needed another workforce for labor on sugarcane plantations. So one way to start over or get away from conflict was to sign contracts as indentured laborers and go to different parts of the world, to British colonies where they had different kind of plantations. So my ancestors, Ng-A-Fook, went over on a boat to Georgetown, Guyana, which was a British colony in South America. And when he arrived, they put, the magistrate was like, your name now is John Cyril Ng-A-Fook. So they did a lot of the renaming of that. So my grandfather, my great-grandfather, he kept John Cyril Ng-A-Fook. So he switched A-Fook to Ng-A-Fook. And then my grandfather was Bertie Cyril Ng-A-Fook. And then my father was Robert Andrew Cyril Ng-A-Fook. And then our generation, they dropped the Cyril. And so my last name is a combination of my great-grandfather's first and last name. And it means good fortune, like good luck, good fortune. But Hakka was also known as guest people because the Hakka is an ethnic group of the Han, which is majority in China. But to escape conflict in central China, in terms of the wars, they left and they went down to what is now southern China in some of the provinces. And they built these villages, but they tried to stay away from the local indigenous communities that were there. They built like these round circle fortifications almost, like that they lived. And so they were always known as guest people in those areas. A lot of Hakka now are part of like Taiwan, Hong Kong, Macau, and in the Caribbean. You'll find those descendants. Even in Canada, like on the west in BC, they will be of depending on when they came over, of Hakka descent. So my last name Ng-A-Fook, and then my mother, she's Elizabeth Gray, and she was Irish-Scottish. And the same thing in terms of thinking about her family living in around Dublin and Chapel Lizard and the War of Independence and the Irish Republican Army were displaced during different times and traveled back and forth between Dublin and Glasgow, Scotland, and that's where I was born. So I was born in Glasgow, Scotland, and this was in the 1970s, 1973. And my mother and father, like in the UK in the 1970s, to have mixed race marriages was frowned upon.
Right,
and they had original Brexit there. At that time, because the UK was quote unquote decolonizing from its former colonies, but they didn't want to see members that weren't British and white coming back to the metropole. So they created different policies of who could become a citizen or not. So my mother, even though she was Irish-Scottish, from Glasgow, Scotland, I was born there. My father, for one reason or another, wasn't able to get British citizenship. So we went down to Guyana, where I was baptized in Georgetown, Guyana, and waited to immigrate for immigration application to Canada and Australia. And this was Pierre Elliott Trudeau was the Prime Minister at the time, and changed the immigration policies where it was more favorable for professionals, and my dad was able to get approval for his application to become a permanent resident in Canada for 3 years. But anyways, to go back, Nicholas, I was named after this horse. My parents found this horse. It was like 200 to 1 to win. I think they bet 5 pounds.
And they won.
And they won. So like my last name means good faith, good luck. And my first name was named after a lucky horse that won this race. So just to introduce, to those that are looking at and listening to your walking video podcast, that's a little bit behind who I am, like Nicholas Ng-A-Fook in terms of my name. And then, we're on the Kitchissippi here, the Great River, right?
Yeah, let's have a look.
Yeah, and I've always, in my family, whether it was my dad's family or my mom, always lived near rivers. So the Clyde River or the Kapuskasing River up in Northern Ontario, where my dad eventually opened his family practice, or even thinking of the different rivers in Guyana. So Guyana has many rivers, and my family always lived close to where there's a river. And it's funny, we don't live that far. We walk down here. My family and myself, we live right next to the Kitchissippi. Yeah.
The Ottawa River. Right?
Yeah, the Ottawa River. Yeah.
Great
River.
It's starting to rain,
Yeah.
which is kind of fun. Well, because we've known each other for a while, I've heard parts of that story. And like you said, there's still a lot more, but what you shared is a lot. Like most people, if you ask them that question, they have a few little things they can say.
Yeah.
And was it always that way for you when you were young? Did you always kind of know all those details and stories, or was it something you pieced together as you aged?
No, it was not. I didn't have all those details. They were fragments of sharing stories. Like my grandfather Edward Gray, he would come over for like 6 months at a time, and this is my mother's father, and
Right.
he was like so much into history and history buff and world history. So I remember he would always ask, did you know this in terms of history, or did you know that? And he would always share. I mean, he was part of the Scottish Guard during World War II. He would always bring us over toy soldiers. The different toy soldiers were the different platoons for all the different armies and the different.
Okay.
So we always looked forward to that as kids. What's Granddad going to bring us over to play with these different toy soldiers? And so my brother Bob and I, when we were young, he'd bring those over, but he'd have a history behind knowing the specifics or specificity of who those soldiers were, what their platoon was, or who they were affiliated with, and share the history of, did you know this battle or that battle? But also knowing like Roman and Greek history as well. So very knowledgeable in terms of, and read a lot. So, and then share the history of the Scots and being, Scottish Catholic or Irish Catholic, and talking about the troubles in terms of what constituted being Catholic and a majority, predominantly Protestant nation, like, and how he navigated that or not. So we had those stories, and the same thing in terms of my father or mother around the dinner table a little bit, but it really didn't start going until I started my master's at York University, and I had Celia Hay Brown as my supervisor, and I asked the question, in the courses I was doing in grad school, I was kind of looking and starting to look at family history, and I was living with my Auntie Merle at the time in Toronto and my Uncle Hewley, and I was really interested in the question that, what does it mean to decolonize oneself? And at first I was trying to understand that in relation to Guyana, and Guyana being a former British colony. Here's where the water's really low right now.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, this is the lowest. So I was just talking to Lori, because Lori comes here and she bikes every morning or runs, and I try to come out running 2-3 times a week, and it was my first time since I came back from Louisiana. And she even said, like, it's funny you say that, because no one would really, I could share with how low the water is right now.
Oh, I see.
But she was saying that she thinks it's either there hasn't been a lot of rain, but also they control the flow of water coming down the Gatineau River through the different dams.
Oh yeah.
And I remember you saying we could tell, what kind of winter it's going to be based on how high.
Yeah. So that one looks fairly high.
Yeah, it looks like it's going to come up. We're going to have snow up to our chest. Yeah.
This is interesting because the ones that I, study back home, they would never build a lodge at a spot that was easily accessible. Yeah.
Maybe if you don't have a lot of options here,
or maybe
or we're just friendlier.
Maybe they're expecting the water to rise.
Well, you usually can't get down here, so the water's a lot higher.
So that's what they're counting on, I guess.
It's like, around Edmonton.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Usually, you couldn't walk down here. That's why, see where the marsh.
Right.
The water would come right up here.
Huh.
Yeah.
So I'm glad you were talking about curriculum studies, because that's one of the questions I had, and I think we both started at our respective universities around the same time, and have that shared interest, that shared commitment to curriculum studies. And you mentioned going to Yale or York.
Yeah.
And Celia Haig Brown, and where do you think that interest in curriculum studies comes from?
I didn't have it originally. When I first went, the Harris government had passed Bill 160 that year. I was a high school teacher, and the climate really wasn't great. I would say the climate would have been the same thing when Ford got into power and said, hey, I'm putting a 1% freeze on all public servants, including teachers. And so it was, I think high school teachers at that time, we taught 6 periods. You had 2 prep, and Harris wanted to separate the principals still in terms of their union was part of the teacher union, so they separated that, increased board sizes, amalgamated smaller boards into larger boards, but also drastically increased high school teachers' workloads to save money across the system.
Oh, yeah.
And so I decided to go back to grad school. And I when I first went back to grad school, it was thinking about, maybe one day I'll be a school VP or principal. That's, or I never thought I would go on to curriculum studies. And it wasn't until I had a first course with Bill Pinar on the introduction to curriculum studies, and I loved the course. It was the first time I was in higher ed that I really love what we're studying. We were reading chapters and books and articles about scholars writing about making sense of their lived experiences in relation to the studies that they were doing, in relation to the world, and talking about the implications for who they are as human beings and the different communities they want to serve, but also the barriers that existed in terms of policy and different kind of political ideologies, in terms of Michael Apple's work. And then I did some great courses. I did a course on psychoanalytical inquiry with Deborah Britzman, and I think she just retired, and they had a celebration. At York. Carl James was there, Warren Critchlow. I didn't do any courses with them. And I did courses with Connie Russell in environmental studies. And so I was doing a minor in environmental studies in the coursework that I was doing. And then I was writing a major research paper because I was doing a master's by coursework.
Oh yeah.
And then when you had at the time to seek out someone who would be your supervisor for your major research paper for the program. And so I did a course with Celia Haig Brown. It was on decolonizing research methodologies.
Okay.
So imagine this, over 20 years ago, Celia creates this course called Decolonizing Research Methodologies. The book that we read is Linda Tuay Smith's Decolonizing Research Methodologies, published in 1999. And so it had just come out, and we're doing this course. And I shared the story that I just shared with you.
Yeah.
And Celia's like, Dad, Nick, you know what? That's a great story. That's an important story. But nowhere in your story about migration did I hear, once you came to Canada, whose traditional territories you grew up on. How did you benefit now as first generation, settler immigrants that, so I never questioned that. Like, so even like you're saying, part of the project of thinking about how does one, this was my thesis question, how does one decolonize oneself, was to look at, in my thesis, my family history, but then also to look at, okay, how come, where's the big forgetting and blind spot in terms of growing up in Treaty 9? And I would say even in that piece, I didn't talk about Treaty 9, I just talked about, at this point in time, I'm so ignorant, I don't know whose traditional territories I'm on. What does someone have to do kind of mindfully to try to unlearn the histories that one's been taught or not taught? And that's kind of where, a lot of that work in the thesis focused on interviewing my aunts and uncles and trying to make sense of like what their lived experience were with living in a British colony or former British colony, living during a time at the same time as Castro and Burnham, who renationalized like industry, and then was ostracized by the United States of America at the same time as Castro, and what it meant to live within that climate as a minority community, like a Chinese minority community. But even in the stories that they share too, what was absent was like, whose traditional territories were they able to prosper or benefit from in Guyana in South America. So there's still, I would say, that work is kind of where I see myself now, is trying to go back and repiece, during the 1970s, if I was here, or 1980s there, what was going on in relation to First Nation activism here in Canada in terms of where I lived, or up in Treaty 9, or here in Ottawa on the unceded ancestral territories of Algonquin people, or even down in Guyana, to think through, who are the First Nations communities down there, Indigenous communities. How are there's so many more in politics now. There's so much more awareness in terms of doing things differently down there, just from some of the people I've spoken to, but I still don't know that those kind of histories. So there's a lot of work to do to try to piece those together. And that was Celia saying, okay, how can we think about revisiting our own past, like, and the kind of narratives, the historical narratives that we share differently, to make, to draw awareness, right? To become more aware and then present to other communities currently, like in terms of what they're experiencing, so we have a better understanding. Maybe more, I would say, kind of a relational empathy in terms of when you see different communities saying, hey, it's been like 200 years, no one's paid attention, and we're still facing like injustices, like, we still have to boil our water, rather than Canadians and myself saying, I don't really know what you're talking about, that we actually have a kind of a historical understanding to add context to how we can address that today in the present, right? Like, be outraged in terms of seeing that stuff going on. I don't think we're there yet in terms of across Canada, but I think education could play a role in doing that. So
yeah, just going back to that meeting you had with Celia Haig Brown, however long ago that was, what do you remember about like how you felt when she mentioned that? What about the lands that you're on? Like now that you've had some time to think about that, how did you respond in a kind of a holistic way? Like, what was going on?
I thought it was a really good question, because it was again, in terms of graduate studies, I don't know if it was where I was at in terms of my mind, but it's really open to really questioning and taking up at York University at the time, was this, to be really critical of one's assumptions and one's ignorance. Right. And they really push, like, well, how do you take that stance, but how do you know what you know or don't know unless you go read the work of others? So at that time, if we're going with the Celia asking that question, and then we were just chatting, and when I read Linda Tway Smith's work, I was like, wow, like, because she opens up that work talking about how history as a discipline works as a regime of truth, and who gets, the Vankers get to write the kind of histories that they want, discipline. But also talking about, she's drawing on Foucault's work there in that intro, but also, so how do you start to think on your own and do your own research to make sense of other people's past experience. I read the other book that we read. I don't know if we read it in the course. I read it on my own, but it was Celia's book, Resistance and Renewal, and it was on the residential schooling system, which was the first time I was introduced to that in the 1990s. I think it was like 1999 or 2000 when I was with her. And just reading that, I was like, why haven't I ever seen this before? And the fact that I think she worked as part of the adult education program there, where, you know, the Kamloops residential school is now, and we see how that unfolded in the media, and people's awareness and what's transpired over the last last 9 years since 2015. I was open. For some reason at that time, I didn't see it as a huge problem when Celia said, hey, I was like, yeah, you know what? I don't. Like, so where does one start? And part of it was, for me strategically, with Celia and others, because most of my profs were women. A lot of them were thinking about the environment. They were thinking about what does it mean to decolonize oneself. They were thinking about critically questioning and trying to disrupt systems of patriarchy. And so for me, I was like, okay, what would happen if I read only texts or books or articles by post-colonial or indigenous feminist women? So that's what I did for my master's thesis too, is I read Katari Spivak's work, Anya Lumba, Linda Toy Smith, several other women who were doing, phenomenal work at that time, and drew on that work to then critically analyze some of the autobiographical narratives that I had constructed as a cisgendered man who grew up in Northern Ontario in a logging town, that really, to be the conceptualization or the concept of being a man up there was very much informed by toxic masculinity, right? Like, you have to be ready to fight, prove your manhood. In many ways, in terms of how manhood is represented in Hemingway. And so that was interesting too. Not interesting, but it was a crucial moment because I grew up reading a lot of Hemingway. I remember my mother, I wasn't, the greatest kid. I had my ups and downs. I would say I was adventurous, very curious, that got me into trouble. But I remember getting grounded, and my mother, she's like, you don't come out of the room till you read these 3 books. And it was like 3 books by Hemingway. I think one was Green Hills of Africa, another one was Farewell to Arms, and I think The Old Man and the Sea. And I started reading and I loved it. But that was kind of thinking about Ernest Hemingway and growing up in Kapuskasing, hunting and fishing. For me, Hemingway was the man's man. And I even did my independent study in grade 12, I think it was, or grade 13. It was OAC.
Really?
On Hemingway. I think it was grade 12, was on the construction. I think I even have some old essays that I read. I'm like, I can't believe I was writing this at the age of 17, 18 about
Hemingway worship?
Yeah, well, just what it means to be a man through the lens of Hemingway.
Wow.
Right? And how one sees the landscape in terms of hunting. And I think grade 13, because I did grade 12 English and I wasn't happy with my grade, so I did it again in OAC. So I did it twice. And the following year, I had a great, both teachers were really good, but Mr. Duff, Ron Duff, and I wanted to look at Alice in Wonderland, the TARDIS, and different, what they call maybe magic realism, or the use of these different devices in literature to help create portholes or transitions into these worlds that you could then imagine and believe. Oh, yeah. So that was focusing more on that in terms of doing that. Anyway, so that's, going from reading Hemingway and then all those years before, and then, arriving in grad studies to be like, okay, I've got a lot of unlearning to do, a lot of work to do. And especially in doing a minor in environmental studies, was Lisa Fawcett for her course. It was Connie Russell, but both of them Connie Russell, we wrote an environmental autobiography. So I was thinking about, my relationship to hunting and fishing differently in terms of the environment, and think about place differently. And then for Lisa Fawcett's class, I had an opportunity to think about just taking for granted fishing and hunting in certain ways, and trying to rethink that again through a feminist lens in terms of the environment, and trying to find different kind of language to describe my relationship to place.
Wow.
Right?
Those are a lot of deep dives, Nick. Like, I could tell you I wasn't writing like that, and when I was in grade 12, I can guarantee you I'm not. So that's interesting to hear all that. But, so the question was about curriculum studies, and you provided a lot of really good understanding for what kind of springboards you into, PhD and then the career that you have. But there was a question you posed a few minutes back where you're sort of reflecting on what you heard from Celia, and you said, what can we do? That was your question. And I think that's a really good question to think about curriculum studies, right? Where can we look for sources of inspiration about how we might handle this difficulty, right?
Yeah.
And so, as you know, this meskanâs, kâpimâcimohk is about walking, talking colonialism, and we've already covered some of that. So I wanted to ask you if you'd share some of those unlearning moments that you've had that were maybe not at the time, but later on you realized that there was something that shifted for you in your understanding of colonialism, like events or experiences you had that you think back on often that had some kind of shift or transformation in how you think about these difficulties.
Well, I mean, that question that Celia posed was one, and just reflecting on, I mean, that was, I would say that question, but then just when you go and you think back through and really think seriously about how you've grown up and the way you framed your relationships and your attitudes and the things that you've done or not done, I was part of the systemic racism against First Nations people without even seeing it. Like just doing that work to think back. So one time, I was at a stag and doe, young, like as teenagers would go to with their friends on the weekend up in Northern Ontario, and got into an altercation at a gas station with another local person in a small town, and they called him Moose. Like, it was this big white guy. I didn't even do anything. It just always you're from out of town, you're having food or whatever, and something happened between someone else, and I just said something. That's pretty, I couldn't take it if one of my friends was being disrespected, so I just said something. Next thing I know, outside with this guy, and the police show up. Well, the police put me in the back of the car and started driving away. And we were just driving. They were going to drive me and maybe dump me off somewhere, right? And they were like, did you know? And so I just, because I had another friend, I just said, hey, what's your badge numbers? Do you know my father's a family physician in the other town? I don't know why you guys are driving me. And they're like, well, you got to remember where you are and really behave yourself. And they came back and they dropped me where my brother was. Well, I didn't think anything. I was like, oh, the police, they just put me in the car, they drove me around, no big deal. But to find out later that was a standard practice for different First Nation men or women, for them to drive them out and drop them off in the winter. This is the winter time, to say, hey, walk back to town. And so just those kind of experiences that I experienced in different ways, and taking them for granted and thinking about what I'm seeing in the media and reading, and trying to make sense of, why are we treating, why have I not seen this, and why have I treated people, and I say treat people in terms of living in Treaty 9, even by not knowing and not being proactively to live differently within that context. So again, Celia's question and thinking about it now, and when you ask that question, thinking back moments, I think it's so fluid. I think, something I could learn tomorrow will trigger an experience that I had to think about it differently. So that was, I think that was a major event. Was that question by Celia, and I think the other was just asking that question and then going down to Louisiana. I knew that I had a lot of work to do. So my question when I went to do my PhD, and Patriots, it's a really good question, and fellow colleagues would laugh. Grad students, I was like, can you become a feminist man?
That was your question.
Yeah, but I wouldn't even ask it now because of Justin Trudeau being like deemed the next generation of feminist man, who's our generation. But I worked on that for 2 years, like at LSU.
Okay.
And so I did a minor in women gender studies during my PhD. I took courses in the women gender studies program. But it was really when I met Brenda Darder-Rubishow and her family and lived with them for 4.5 years, just the living and being with the United Home Nation, the community members, elders, and just doing things with them and seeing what they were fighting for and what their struggles were and how strong, as crawfish warriors, women, men, coming together, and despite everything that's happened with love, humility, and kindness, rage sometimes, and laughter, it just changed the way I look back at Canada. So I would say going to Louisiana State University and looking at how historical segregation and racism worked down there helped to create a framing and window to look back critically at Canada. And so that just being down there and working with the tribal historian Michael T. Mayhart Dardar, who was reading like Fanon, and he was reading all of these Native American activists, and he'd give these books to me. He's like, read this, read that. And so again, it just different ways of these stories, like the stories and books they got me to read, were about different lived experiences in relation to different historical events that I'd never been introduced to as part of the school curriculum, if we think about curriculum studies. So that was a real education for me for 4 years, just being introduced to other people's lived experiences and their histories and what they were fighting for. That was a major event or impact in terms of thinking and seeing the world differently back here as a Canadian citizen, like a first generation immigrant Canadian citizen. So I had questions again when I get back. So it's like, okay, if this is what's going on in Louisiana in terms of what they're experiencing, when I get back to Canada, what's going on in terms of wherever I end up here in Ottawa. So I think that just being and living and meeting with them, and as you know, I was just back there for 2 weeks, and when I text Brenda and I say, hey, I'm coming down for 2 weeks, she's like, can't wait to have you home, son. And so there's a real, just spending that time in those relationships. There's a real, they were like my other parents, and really brought me up to see the world differently down there, and also the community members that I had a chance to be with. So I always feel in when I go back there, one, just the smell, it just feels in part like home, like it does here.
And sweaty.
Well, it wasn't, it was 30 degrees down there, but it wasn't that bad.
Oh, yeah.
I was enjoying it so much, but it's the live oak trees and the kind of the saltiness of the air in Baton Rouge. That's the live oak trees in certain places. Yeah. And then the not being far from the Mississippi River. But then down in Raceland, in terms of the intercoastal, the same thing. It's like, it's the boue pourri, the rotten mud that Jason and I joke about smelling. And just, I don't know if that's because of growing up in my formative years in Kapuskasing in a rural town where the rivers flow north, and being around rivers and just that rurality in terms of there's some sense of home place. But in Louisiana, I feel like that too, the rurality of certain places that I go there, just there's like something there that I could feel in my, it's hard to explain, I could feel in my bones, so.
I was down there once, as you know, a long time ago now, and Yeah, my overriding impression was this is a pretty unique place. Like, yeah, the smell and things just seem to hang in the air down there. That's something I remember. Okay, so I got one more thing for you. Big question. Not really. As I've been listening to you, as we've been walking along, there's a lot of mapping and unmapping that I'm doing, because you're talking about locations and places and moving and relationships. And I remember our friend, the late Narcissus Blood.
Yeah.
He was speaking about Abraham Maslow and others, but he said that one observation that they had made was that if you look at all the dominant theories of human development that are in the social sciences that most undergrads around the world, really, well, anyway, this part of the world, are exposed to when they begin studies, they consistently leave out place. The significance of place to humans and how they understand themselves.
They're like placeless. Like, this can be generalized anywhere. It doesn't matter.
So what I wanted to ask is, like, through this way of kind of, we might call it unlearning, or the questions you're asking, how has your relationship to place kind of also gone with it? Like, how are you thinking about places?
That's a great question. Like, well, I think you need to spend time in place to get to know it as a relative, if you will. Like, those stories, you asked me, like, Nick, how did you piece together these stories? Well, spending time sitting and talking to my aunts and listening differently. Like, teach me. Like, I want to hear about what your lived experiences were during this time in history. Like, what were you doing? What were you feeling? With United Home Nation, it was the same thing. But also, when I was in Louisiana, and we were laughing this time, like, Brenda was like, Nick, you coming to do research, you going fishing? And the joke was, I said, I'm doing both. I'm doing both. So Josh and I would go fishing all the time. And on this recent trip I learned so much in 5 hours just talking with Jason about his oyster farm and coastal restoration and the marsh and the politics, in terms of climate change impact, and what his vision and what he's trying to do to educate others to get into oyster farming and the importance of doing that. And then Josh, an hour or two with him, and Stephanie talking about their work in Washington, D.C., but connected to place. And then Mike Robichaud, who's a senator in Louisiana, talking to him about his family's been there for a couple hundreds of years. And so I spent a lot of time, 4 years of going fishing a lot with Josh. We go fishing in pirogues and go in the intercoastal. I was trying to learn the art of sight fishing for redfish. I was so clumsy. Like, there's such an art to doing it. But we would go at different times, and the tide would come up. And then when we come out, it was like at his grandfather's place, and his grandfather might have been coming back from trawling for shrimp or oystering, and his father was a treater in the community. So we'd stop, we'd talk, and his father would point out, the different plants and medicines so it's just being like, that can't happen, I don't think, as quickly unless you're there in place to actually see and smell and taste and feel what's the educational library that Whitney, is making reference to. And we joked about this one story. Whitney had come back from oystering. I got this amazing old photo of him. I think it's black and white. And he's like, Nick, you like oysters? I'm like, yeah, I love oysters. He's like, you like big oysters? I'm like, I love big oysters. He opens this huge oyster. It's like, it's like 40 degrees out. I ate it. It was like huge. I've never had an oyster that big. Here in Canada, I'm like, oh, it's pretty good. He's like, me, I prefer the small ones. so I share that story with Jason. We laugh. Because the big ones, if you knew anything, they're for frying, right? Or to grill on the. I'd say doing the same thing, like growing up in Kapuskasing, the one thing. And my dad did it down in Guyana. Like, he went hunting and fishing a lot. And when you hunt and fish, you're out on the land, and you have a different kind of relationship to being on the land, I think, in terms of your senses when you're hunting and fishing and what you need to be present to. And I grew up hunting and fishing in Kapuskasing and always looked forward to the different seasons. Like, right now would be, we're in November, we'd be approaching the end of the moose hunt season, and I would go with my brother almost every weekend. Bob and I would go, he was 50 and I was 60, and the parents would let us go with the truck, and we'd go into a hunting camp and spend the whole weekend just walking in the forest, hunting for rough grouse and ducks and moose that we never see. But it was just being able to do that at such a young age. Or fishing. Like, we went to this lake system of Rufus Lake, Opsatica Lake, and Pendleton, and it's a huge lake system, and just knowing where to go when the wind came in a certain way, or if it was a certain time of year, or if the water was low, you gain that knowledge, which I don't have here. Like, I don't spend a lot of time fishing on the Ottawa River.
Yeah.
I've gone up in Quebec into the Basketon Reservoir, and it's the knowledge to be able to fish and do well at fishing or be knowledgeable is completely different in terms of place. So I think, place is so important, and the particularity of place and the wisdom, as you would say, that sits in place is so different. Jonah and I, when we went across this summer to visit with different communities, different sites in the residential schools, I hadn't really visited you or thought about, Lake Winnipeg, the Assiniboine, the Red, South Saskatchewan, North Saskatchewan, up to the Rockies and across over in a certain way. Not like it completely changed in terms of visiting and going for a walk with you there, about the knowledge that sits in place there, and that was like what, a couple of hours, and those couple of hours are so important to think about, even at a distance. My relationship with you, the communities that you're collaborating with, and your students, differently in relation to how I am here in Ottawa with, whether it's Algonquin communities from Kitigan-Zibi or Pequawknagon. It provoked me to ask questions differently, or to think differently in terms of place, because of how I experienced place with you out there. So I think it's really important that others have access to that, like teacher candidates, educators, to think about how we can experience place in other communities differently. Because in the classroom, you can only do so much. Right? Like you can show things on a whiteboard or a film, but it's not quite the same thing. Just the last thing would be, one of the studies that we did in research in terms of thinking about residential school survivors and having students think about teacher candidates, thinking about other people's past experiences in relation to the intergenerational harms of residential schools, is that when we looked and compared students that maybe go to a website like Where Are the Children and look at a virtual exhibit, and you ask them, like, write a letter to the survivor about how you plan to address this or what you'd like to do in a future classroom, versus the students that went up to Kitigan-Zibi, met with elders, but not only met with elders, experienced protocol and ceremony in terms of prior to sitting in a circle, going around, introducing themselves, and then listening to survivor. We did see a difference in the kind of letters that they wrote. So that the ceremony of listening, or the encounter with in person and hearing the survivor stories in a certain place, made a huge difference, pedagogically and relationally for those students. So I do, see that.
That's a lot. Well, if it is, let's
look at that.
have a look at the sunset here.
It's got the gray.
It's beautiful. Yeah, and listening to you, I'm connecting a lot of things and feeling kind of inspired with how passionate you are about all this stuff. It's great. You're a gifted educator, Nick, and somebody I really like to spend time with. So thanks for taking the time to walk with me here today.
Well, thank you.
And I got to tell you, Don Wiseman and I have had lots of conversations, but one thing we shared was going for a walk. Is it research or walk? And yeah, she said both.
Yeah.
So we always have fun with that.
I just want, you asked about events, and I would say, and I'm not just saying this because it's you, but meeting you, Cynthia, Narcisse, Erica, like, that was life-changing, because when I came back to Canada, I was kind of lost, and you all took me in, mentored me, and nurtured who I am as a scholar, but a human being. And all of you always stress, like, be a good human being. And if you're a good human being, maybe you'll be a good educator. So
Yeah.
thanks so much for that too, Dwayne.
Hey, hi.